All right, thank you, Eric. Thanks for getting me set up and getting everybody on board with this. So yeah, this is a recap with a couple small additions of a presentation that I gave at the GLACUHO Fall 2013 conference. And so anybody who was at that or heard about it from that, you'll see a lot of similarities here. It's a lot of the same sort of materials. So starting off, I want to talk a little bit, let's see, organize my controls here. I'll talk a little bit about why me, and how I got interested in the topic of missing students. It's not a topic that a lot of res life professionals are involved in. Well, a lot are involved in, but not a lot do a lot of research on. This started off, before starting college, I actually spent 4 years in the Marine Corps, and then while I was in college, I spent 6 years in the Army National Guard. And from a military standpoint, I was involved in a number of similar type of things. And so when I became an RA, when I became a hall director, the idea of tracking down, finding missing students didn't seem that strange to me. But there were always some pieces of it that I didn't quite understand, or I always felt like we could do better with. A couple years ago, we had a really high-profile missing student incident here on our IU campus. A student named Lauren Spearer went missing, and I showed up and volunteered, starting off as one of the volunteer searchers, and within a few days found myself running much of the volunteer operations side of the house, and being involved, working hand in hand with law enforcement and being part of the university's response for helping organize thousands of searchers a day and other things. And from that, I got interested in the idea of how does a university look for or handle missing students. I also got involved in search and rescue on a professional level, the National Association for Search and Rescue. I'm a certified search and rescue instructor, a lost person incident manager, and a number of other things. Out of all that, there's only about 200 certified search and rescue instructors in the country. I'm pretty sure I'm the only one in res life, so that really kind of makes an interesting crossover for what we consider our routine missing students. So what are we going to talk about today? I'm going to talk briefly about kind of what our current practice is in the field, some ideas from the search and rescue community that we can expand on in residence life, and how you can utilize those ideas to improve your planning and your policies. Now, I don't want you to go into this thinking that this is purely based on my experience here at IU Bloomington. Prior to this, I also did my master's and worked at Mississippi State University. And when I began looking into this, I began contacting some of my colleagues at other institutions. I'm also a part-time doctorate student on the doctorate program, and so I started reaching out to folks at other institutions and talking with vice presidents of student affairs, deans of students, chief of police. And all in all, I think I talked to about 13 different universities to kind of get a feel for where their policies are, where their practices are, what sort of things do they do when it comes to missing students. From that, I also collected a number of stories that I'll share with you today to kind of illustrate various points of it. So let's start off by asking, and this is a kind of a thought-provoking piece in the webinar sense. I want you to think to yourself, how would you respond to each of these situations? So for instance, a resident comes to your office worried because he hasn't seen or heard from his roommate since last Friday. How would you respond? What would be your first questions? What would be your first steps? Now, this one's commonplace enough. This probably has happened to a lot of people out there. Not that unusual. Probably have some idea of how you would respond to this. So what if a parent calls because she hasn't heard from her son in 2 days and they talk or text every day? According to her, his cell phone is in his room, but in checking his room, he isn't there, but his phone is. How do you respond to this? What situations does this bring to mind? What thoughts do you have? Is your response different when it comes from a parent versus comes from a fellow student? Because again, these are all rhetorical questions to kind of think for yourself, because we're going to dig deeper into them in a minute. On a Monday morning, parents of a non-student call and say he came to campus over the weekend to see a friend and go to a football game, and he was probably going to stay in your building but hasn't come home and they're worried about him. How is it different if we're looking for a non-student who may have been a visitor, may have been a guest in our residence hall, than it is if we're looking for a student? Last scenario, so a female student went on an out-of-state vacation, went to an out-of-state vacation spot a week and a half ago for spring break. No one has heard from her since. How do we respond to that? What sort of pieces, what sort of thoughts go into that? These are all real examples, and we're going to come back and revisit them again later on when we kind of talk through some of these procedures and some of these pieces. So our current response, what would we do in these cases? Well, the first thing I learned as I was going through and doing this research is that the answer varies widely, even at one institution. So if you're sitting there next to a colleague and your answer to how you would respond to one of those scenarios was completely different than the colleague sitting next to you, don't be surprised. That's the norm. Even at the senior levels, very often I would have a dean of students and associate dean of students that would tell me two very different ways that they would respond to the same situation, and they worked at the same institution. Oftentimes, these things are very much based on individual knowledge and experience. What's your individual experience? Who have you looked for? What sort of people have you found? What sort of pieces have you put together in the past when you're dealing with one of these sort of situations? And the reality is we generally have very little training. This isn't one of our scenarios that we do a lot of behind closed doors or a lot of background area on when we're trying to do it. We don't do a lot of formal training in these things. Now, on the upside, often it is based on a written protocol. Most campuses have some sort of steps for a missing student or a missing student process that they go through and who needs to be notified when and where. Generally, it's a little vague, and it's designed to cover all situations, which leaves some details out. That response is usually also unique to your campus. So how a small private liberal arts institution with 4,000 students responds may be very different than a 40,000 plus residential campus with 12,000 students on campus. Those sort of pieces can be very different types of response. And one other piece of it is often it's unique to who reports it and not the individual. So a concerned parent, that report is processed or thought about very differently than a concerned student, than a concerned faculty member, than something else. One of the things on our campus that we do regularly is we run what we call a no-swipe report. And in our card reader buildings, this tells us if a student hasn't been in the building for a week or so, it'll let us know who hasn't swiped into the building for a week, and we can kind of follow up and see what's happening, go talk to the roommate, look at some of these sort of things. That report generates a completely different response if we think that a student hasn't swiped into their residence hall in a week, because of course very often it turns out they're simply staying with a friend, they went to spring break early, they did whatever. So how does where that information come from affect your current response? So these are all questions as you're thinking through training, as you're thinking through protocols that you want to kind of ask yourself, and where is it okay for it to be different and where is it not okay? Now I'm going to jump topics a little bit here for a second. I want to talk about what we can learn from the search and rescue community, because what we can learn from them is that there are some standards that no matter where the report comes from, no matter who reports it or when and where, it is possible to set up a basic understanding of who you're going to go look for. So in search and rescue, whether you're looking for a 6-year-old that wandered off from a campsite, or you're looking for an Alzheimer's patient who has left out of a healthcare facility, or you're looking for a hunter that hasn't returned from a hunting trip, or a lost backpacker, there are some very basic sort of steps that you use in trying to do that. So what you want to do is there are 2 key points that you always establish in search and rescue. The first is what we call the point last seen, or the PLS. Where was the last time that somebody who positively knew this person laid eyes on them, whether it was their roommate, their boyfriend, their girlfriend, a friend, their RA, someone who could see them and say, yes, that's Steve, I know what Steve looks like, that's definitely Steve, saw them. The second piece of information that we want to look for is something we call the last known point, or the LKP. The last known point is somewhere that we've got a pretty strong suspicion that they were. So for instance, an LKP might be, we found their car at the stadium, so we have some idea that they were at the stadium. An LKP might be that we see that they used their meal points in the dining hall, so chances are they might have been there, depending on how much students swap meal ID cards and meal cards at your university. You get an idea that they may have been there. When did they log into a computer on campus? That was probably them. Other people might not have their password, so that might be the last known point where they were. And we're going to talk about some of these possible LKPs here in a minute. The other thing that we can learn from SAR is they have something called a search urgency matrix. Sounds really fancy. It's not quite as fancy as it sounds, and different search and rescue organizations, different law enforcement agencies will use different search urgency matrix. They make up their own. But most of them are fairly standard. They have a lot of the same sort of information on them. The first thing that they look at is an individual's preparedness, habits, and physical condition. So, when you're deciding how urgent is it that you look for someone, is it more urgent that you go look for someone who hasn't returned from the football game yet, but wasn't reported as being drinking or having drank alcohol or being involved with anything particular at the football game other than going to it? Or is it more important when you go look for someone who has consumed alcohol, who has been out late at night, who maybe attempted to walk home from a bar or a party or someplace like that? So those are, how prepared is that individual? What's their physical condition to be in the situation that they're in? The second thing that a search urgency matrix looks at is environmental factors, campus events, weather, those sort of things. Those of us that work in the northern parts, certainly in GLACUHO, but in the northern parts, you have to worry about weather. If somebody's been out at a party or off campus and they attempt to walk back to campus and it's freezing cold weather, they get lost, something happens, they don't find their way back, that weather can be a factor in how urgent of a search do you want to put out there. How many staff are you going to get involved? How involved is law enforcement going to be in looking for this person? Campus events, if you've got a large party or a large event going on campus, what are the chances that they're just somewhere at that event and they haven't been found yet because they've met up with some other friends or something like that? The third piece that we deal with a little bit more often is, are there mental health concerns? Are they despondent? Are they possibly suicidal? Is there something that concerns us about their behavior? Did they recently break up with a significant other? Those are all part of what goes into this matrix. And to give you an idea of what one of these looks like, this is an example of what one of those looks like. This is a search urgency assessment. And as you look down through here, this one's designed for a little bit more of a wilderness type of area. But the important part is you can see that there are numbers that go down through there. So for instance, if you're looking at age, somebody who's older is more urgent. Somebody who's very young or very old is more urgent than someone who's not. Somebody with a known illness requiring medication is more important than someone who seems relatively healthy. And you basically write it down as a score in the next column on the right side there. And you can see if you look down at the bottom, anything that scores a 9 through 17 is considered an emergency response. 18 through 27 is measured, and 28 through 33 is evaluate and investigate. Now, whether or not that this may seem a little cold and it may not dictate what you actually do. There's plenty of times that somebody might not seem like they're an emergency response case, but for some reason people are really worried about them, so you may want to elevate their emergency response. But something like this is what your campus law enforcement is most likely going to use in determining how hard they need to look, how many resources they need to call in order to go look for a student. Now, what are some good practices? Well, one of the pieces I mentioned before was written protocols. one of the pieces that within residence life, within student affairs, that we don't really have a lot of written protocols about is who calls who and who checks what. So for instance, there was a case, another institution here in Indiana several years ago, where a student had been in a residence hall, had been in a party, had been potentially consuming alcohol, and then never returned to his residence hall. Next morning, law enforcement, Res Life staff are looking all over the place for the student. They go through all of the places within the area that they think he may have been found or that they think he may be. However, one of the pieces that goes along with that is how many of you have spaces in your buildings that you don't have access to? Maybe they're computer rooms, maybe they are offices that you don't have keys to, maybe there are reasons that for safety you don't have access to, like a high voltage room. Well, in this case, one of those high voltage room doors had been left open, and unfortunately the student had found that on his way back into the building without his ID card and found that high voltage room. And so that case didn't have a good ending, but they weren't able to find him for quite some time because the staff said, well, you know, he couldn't get in there, that door's locked, nobody needs to go check that, and it never was checked because they didn't have access to go in and check it. Unfortunately, in search and rescue, oftentimes we learn from our mistakes. We learn from the things that went wrong on a search so that we can then improve the search in the future. So think about that. Who checks what areas of your buildings and in your halls, and who manages it from there? The next piece is a clear understanding of search urgency. Many of you have probably been through this before, where maybe you have a faculty member or an administrator that, you know, wants to call out the Marines, call out the guard, go look for this student, and you know that this is a student that, you know, they've only been gone a few hours. They very regularly disappear for a day or two to go hang out with friends or go to a fraternity house or whatnot else, and simply not being able to reach them doesn't quite seem like it's as much of an urgent case to you as it does to them. And this is a case where if everyone on your campus has a clear understanding of the search urgency, you can use that as a way of talking with them. Next up is a checklist of possible tracking points. This is something that I always say is a great project for any grad students that are out there that are looking for a master's project or a practicum or internship project. Is work with your Dean of Students office or emergency management or police department to develop a list of possible tracking points. There are a few universities out there that do this, and those that do just rave about the success of having this list. So for instance, this would be a list of all the places that a student might show up and who has access to that information and when. So for instance, if you want to try and see if a student has been to the recreation center in the past 2 or 3 days, but it's 10 o'clock on a Saturday night, who has access to that information? Who does the Dean of Students, who does the residence life staff contact to say, hey, we got this missing student, we're worried that they might have wandered into your facility or come to your facility, can you check for us? Who would have the ability to do that? And I got a whole list of examples here of places that might be. It's amazing what can be tracked on a campus by someone somewhere. In fact, to the point where several people that have these lists on their campus, even deans of students, have said that, you know, this list kind of creeps some people out because they're amazed at all the different places that you might be able to be tracked on campus. I think the one that gets people the most is the Wi-Fi logs. So if you've got a smartphone, a tablet, a laptop, whatever that runs off of campus Wi-Fi, every time you start it up and you hit that Wi-Fi, somewhere in the computer system it logs that you logged in on that Wi-Fi and knows that you were there. Somebody in your university IT office can then backtrack to say, yes, this person was over in this residence hall or was doing these things. One campus reported to me that they had a case of a student that they believed might be despondent, might be having some suicidal ideation, and they were really worried about her, and they were able to use her cell phone, the Wi-Fi on her cell phone, not the actual cell phone itself, but the Wi-Fi, to determine which room she was in and where she was hiding in another residence hall in order to track her down and talk with her about the situation. Some other examples, you know, a student's bursar account, whether or not a student recently got a refund check might come into play as to whether or not they've suddenly gone missing or where they may have gone. Security cameras, athletic tickets, health center records, and obviously health center records, you're looking at HIPAA information and some other pieces that go along with that. But has a student recently visited the health center? That's again one of those that somebody at the health center may say, hey, we want to check in on this. Oh yeah, it turns out this student has been coming in for counseling. They now need to make a call as HIPAA professionals about what they need to share and what they don't about a student that may now be missing. Student organization meetings, on and off campus jobs. We've had several cases of a student that has stopped going to class and stopped living in the residence halls but has continued to work at their off-campus job. And so being able to track that down and know that information as to whether they have an on or off-campus job. So while a search is happening, and this is a slide that I added because I got a number of questions about this after GLACUHO, and this is one I had done in previous presentations, is talked about kind of the campus response to how a search happens. So what are the information campaign resources that you have as a residence life professional? How do you get the word out that a student is missing, or hey, we're looking for this student? These might include flyers, social media, emails, stuff like that. More importantly, though, is what information can you gather and bring back? So students themselves contributing information, how does it flow back up to those that need it? We had a case of a missing student here on campus just a year and a half ago or so, where the student, we said, hey, we're really worried about the student, we don't know what happened to him. She had gone out with a group of friends, they had gone to a couple of parties that evening. One of the parties wound up getting busted by the police department. She was last seen running off from the party with a group of other students. Well, it turned out that one of the students who lived on her floor and had been at the party with her said, well, she met some guy there that she happened to know from high school. And we said, okay, well, how do we backtrack that? How do we figure out who that was and get that information? And that wound up being the key piece of information that helped with it. However, the police department and the Res Life staff had yet to talk to her. She actually told her RA that she knew she had met this guy from high school at this party. Turned out she was at his apartment off campus. So how do you backflow information? How do RAs and residence life staff say, hey, we heard something, it may be important, it may not be. How do we get it back to law enforcement or whoever's working on this search? Support issues. Now this is one that at the highest levels of the university often comes into play. This might include costs such as overtime for staff. If you're going to have maintenance staff coming in and searching maintenance areas of buildings, that may involve overtime. If you're going to have hourly staff that are helping out with parts of responding to things or looking for things, are there overtime pieces that come into that? Now, of course, all these are examples. These are longer searches than what residence life staff are generally involved in. You know, most of our searches end within a few hours of getting started. But if you have something that goes over the course of a couple of days, you can run into this, and we'll get into an example of this here in a minute. Physical support space. This may just be having a conference room that police department can set up in and start gathering information and putting stuff together. Or if it's more of a prolonged search, you know, there may be a greater need, such as housing for people that are involved with the search or specialists that get called in. Also, while the search is happening, you have to deal with student reactions, and these can happen in very short-term searches or very long-term searches. Those include counseling and spiritual support. So you may have students that want to have a prayer vigil or candlelight vigil. They may want to have other types of events. They may want counseling. They may want pastoral care. What resources do you have, and who can you pull in to do those sort of things on your campus? Also, while the search is happening, oftentimes students feel a need to have a site, be it physical or electronic, that they can contribute memories, thoughts, share emotions, congregate. This is especially true if the search turns out to be negative. You know, if it goes on and the student isn't found, or if the student is found and not able to return to the university for whatever reason, if they've passed away or whatnot, these sites can become very important. Student control of the response is, while knowing different students need different things, is a big deal. We certainly have seen this several times with residence life staff where you know, a student goes missing, and what some students feel should be happening isn't what other students feel should be happening, and you get these kind of what I call residence hall debates that pop up, where people feel like, oh, they're doing too much, they're not doing enough, oh, this person's just, they shouldn't be spending resources looking for this type of person, it's their own fault, or it's not their own fault, or whatever's going on. This really becomes an educational opportunity for residence hall staff, particularly RAs and graduate students, to kind of have those conversations with folks and kind of process through those feelings and those emotions that are sometimes very raw during a situation like this. There's a few misconceptions I want to just briefly address to kind of get those out there. The first is there's a lot of people who think that there's a 24 or 48-hour waiting period before law enforcement and other people can be involved with a missing student. That's not true. Part of the PROTECT Act of 2003 includes federal guidelines for things like Amber Alerts and whatnot. But there's a part of that called Suzanne's Law. And Suzanne's Law is named after Suzanne Lyle, who was a college student at SUNY Albany. She disappeared while walking home from her job off campus one night in 1998. The parents fought to get the police to do something faster, but at the time the police department said, well, she's over 18 and she has to be gone 48 hours. That's what our state law is, and that's how we have to go with it. So they really didn't do anything for the first 48 hours or so. Now the campus responded. The campus made a number of attempts, but law enforcement, particularly the off-campus law enforcement, didn't really do what was considered a satisfactory response by the parents. And so Suzanne's Law got enacted. It eliminates waiting periods for people between the ages of 18 and 21. And now a missing person report can be filed at any point on anyone. Doesn't mean law enforcement is going to take action, but a missing person report can be filed at any point for anyone. In most jurisdictions, they will look at something like that search urgency chart to try and decide if they want to get involved with it. The other piece is that of Suzanne's Law says that 18 to 21-year-olds now fall under the National Crime Information Center and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which are two national resources run by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And they will send resources and assistance if you have a student that's gone for a prolonged period of time and missing, and especially if there might be something suspicious about her or him having disappeared, they will get involved with that, and they bring a wealth of resources to your campus when they do that. Another misconception is that this is a law enforcement issue, not a college issue. That may be true. And oftentimes, especially at smaller schools that maybe don't have their own law enforcement, it can very much feel this way. However, I'd challenge that, and I would say that this is a partnership. There are a lot of resources that a university can bring to bear. There's a lot of information that a university has that can assist law enforcement with this, and very often law enforcement isn't going to think of these things. Law enforcement isn't going to know that they can look at the last time they swiped their meal plan in the dining hall, or they may assume that somebody's already done that. So having a list, having that list of last known points already made up that law enforcement can then go and check through and say these are the things that, that have been done already is a great resource. It's helpful to them, and it's helpful on the student affairs side, the res life side, for doing those sort of things. The other misconception is that it's a dean's or a university police department issue. We can't help or shouldn't help. As I did my research, as I called around and interviewed and talked with VPs and deans of students, I don't know how many times one of the first things they told me is, you know who's really good at finding people on our campus? Res Life. You know, the residence hall staff, they find people all the time. They know the students. They know where the students go. They know who they hang out with. They know what they do. They know which fraternities are involved with which sororities. They were very complimentary and very adamant about the fact that residence life is one of the departments that really is involved and in touch with the students to the point where they sometimes understand student behavior in ways that law enforcement, especially in off-campus law enforcement, might not understand them. And so it is important. All of them stress the importance of res life playing a role in looking for a missing student. So let's go back to some of our examples that we had earlier, and let's talk about those for a minute. So our first example, a resident comes to your office worried because he hasn't seen or heard from his roommate since last Friday. Fairly routine occurrence. Something like this, happens fairly regularly. Just had it happen to me last month. First thing I did is start looking at the last known points. When was the last time the student used their ID card to swipe in and out of the building? When was the last time they used meal points? And then we elevated it up through our system here using LKPs to track down when was the last time anybody saw or heard from the student. And at the same time, we started making attempts to call a cell phone, call other places to find out what was going on. We didn't get any answer on the cell phone, but we did manage to send an email that eventually we got a response from that the student had decided that they were just going to take a long weekend and they wouldn't be back for a few extra days. Okay, that's fine, not a problem. Glad we were able to track you down and ease your roommate's concerns. In the future, you might want to let your roommate know that if you're going to take a long time so they don't freak out a little bit on us. A parent calls because she hasn't heard from her son in 2 days. They talk or text every day. According to her, his cell phone is in his room, but in checking his room, he isn't there, but his phone is. Now this is one of my favorites because this involves stuff that 10 years ago we never would have imagined, which is the ability of parents to actually track down the location of a cell phone using the Find My iPhone app or some of these other apps that are out there for tracking their children. In this case, it actually wasn't a Find My iPhone app. It was some sort of parent tracker that a company offered. However, his phone was in his room. It was a Friday. Nobody had seen or heard from him. He lived in a single room. Nobody'd seen or heard from him. And the mom actually drove down here from Indianapolis, which is about an hour away, and was just driving back and forth between the residence hall and the police station, just constantly yelling at somebody about our need to go find her son and search for her son. Law enforcement did a missing persons report and made some efforts at it. We were eventually able to find the son. It turns out that he had recently gotten his bursar refund check. And he had also, over the course of his time as a freshman, gotten really good at online poker. And apparently when you get really good at online poker, the decision you make is to cash your refund check, buy a plane ticket in cash, and fly out to Vegas so that you can get even better at poker. However, this didn't work in his favor. He did not get better at poker. He lost all of his refund check and returned on Sunday to a really upset and angry mom, which ironically he had left the phone in his room because he knew that his mom could track it and he didn't want her to know he had gone to Vegas. So yeah, he had a lot that didn't work out for him on that one. On Monday morning, parents of a non-student call and say he came to campus over the weekend to see a friend and go to a football game, but he hasn't come home. So as a non-student, what abilities do you have? What sort of information do you have? Now obviously a lot of your last known points are going to be a lot harder to come by. There's going to be a lot less information about a student like that. However, knowing who he came to visit, knowing who else he knows on campus, may help you in tracking down some of that information and using some of those last known points to track down friends and people that he may have been with can be very helpful. Colleague of mine at another university in the GLACUHO region told me this story as we were talking about this presentation and whatnot else. And one of the things that they thought was the most amazing about it is they talked to the student who he had been there to visit, who said, well, yeah, he knows a lot of people here. There's a lot of people from his high school who go to school here. And what they did is the registrar's office actually ran a list of all the people who went to his high school who went to that institution. They were able to pull that data, and from that, his friend kind of went through the list and said, well, these are people that he used to hang out with, and they managed to contact all of them until they found him. Turns out his phone had died, he didn't bring a charger, and he just had decided that he didn't need to go back home yet, and he was going to spend a couple of extra days there. So sometimes, these turn out to be, fairly typical student behaviors, even from our non-students, that help us out. Also, this recently hit the news. Butler University up in Indianapolis had a high school student that was there for a band concert who disappeared from the campus. And I think they're still working out exactly what happened to him, but they managed to find him outside of Indianapolis. I believe it was about an hour away from Indianapolis, with a kind of story about getting in cars and riding with people and doing all sorts of things. But at least initially, the response focused on the Butler campus and the area around that in trying to determine where he may have gone in the area around that. Our last example that was on there, and I changed it in the first one. This one says Panama City specifically, because this is the story that I remember from a dean of students that I talked with, about a female student who went to Panama City Beach over spring break. No one has heard from her since she went down there. Talking to her friends, she had met some guys there that she had hung out with most of the rest of the time, kind of left her friends. And it was actually about 2 weeks after spring break that they were able to track her down. I believe she had gone 2 or 3 states away, and had basically gone back to wherever these guys were from that she had met over spring break, and was staying there and staying with them. And it was through being able to track down some of this information among friends and keeping up with social media and finding other bits of information that they were able to track this piece down. Now we all know that sometimes our students don't make good choices, and when they don't is sometimes the reasons that we have missing students that we need to go look for. I've got a little bit of additional information that's on here in case you are interested in looking more into this topics or into these topics. I would certainly suggest the Campus Crisis Management book. It covers a number of different crises that may come up on campus. It's a little broad. These other books are actually out of the search and rescue community and things that we use. I'll kind of close with sharing my information. I obviously, this is one of the things that we do in search and rescue is people will track data and track information about a particular population. And so some people get interested in Alzheimer's patients, some people get interested in campers, hikers, whatever. And they basically try and gather as much information as they can and be involved with as much detail as they can about these sort of situations. Well, I chose college students. College students are the area that's the most interesting to me. What are the areas that where do they go? What sort of things happen to them? And through this, I've worked with 4 or 5 universities now, some of which were either people that came to presentations I've done at state, regional, national conferences, or they're former colleagues of mine from here at IU or in the doctorate program that have wound up with missing students on their campuses that they now work at, that have called me up and said, hey, I want to talk to you about a situation we've got going on, what's happening, whatnot. I'm more than happy to do that. I'm more than happy to talk with anybody. I'm more than happy to work with folks on revamping policies pertaining to missing students and practices, training, any of those sort of things. But more importantly, I think in my mind, as somebody who also works in search and rescue, when the call comes in that somebody's missing, what are the things that we can do to help out? What are the pieces we can do? And so in that sense, I'm more than happy to consult with anybody at any level within Res Life, Student Affairs, University Police Department about what are tracking points, what are things that they can do, and how can they help. That's just part of the volunteer nature of working in search and rescue and being a part of that. So now I'm going to go ahead. I think Jamie is going to be getting, moderating questions. And hopefully I'll have some out there, because I got through that a little ahead of schedule. And let me know, what are the questions that are out there?
Yeah, thanks, Thanks, John. One of the things is, can you flip back to the recommended reading list just for a few moments? And feel free to type in other questions as you have them. One question that I had was just like best advice for working with our student staff members when they are working with their residents within this topic area, of how to like respond when someone says that someone's missing or something like that.
Yeah, that's always a tough one because it's going to elicit different kind of reactions from other people, from different people. One of the things on our campus, every time there's a fear that there's a student missing, the first thing out of somebody's mouth is, "Oh no, it's going to be another Lauren Spear." And oftentimes people don't understand that there was a very different sort of context involved with that, and that your friend who went to his fraternity house for the night and hasn't come back yet probably isn't the same situation that that Lauren was in. So having them kind of think through, look, there are people on this campus who have experience looking for missing students. We're going to get them involved. We're going to get them out there looking. In the meantime, here's some things that you can do to help. Monitor social media, send them a Facebook message, shoot them a text. Who do you know that they might know that you can get a hold of? Who might have been around them? Who might have seen them? Ask them those questions and get that information. Very often when you're dealing with a missing student, oftentimes you're just looking for the student. Nobody's going to be interfering with a police investigation by saying, "Hey, has anybody seen Steve?" That's not going to be part of it. If for some reason the police department thinks that it would be, they're going to let you know that. They're going to tell you, "Hey, we'd really rather get everybody back off of this. We need to look into this." And that may be the case, but generally they're just as happy for somebody else to find Steve as they are to be the ones to find Steve.
Thank you very much, John. Are other questions out there? Okay. Let's see, we've got one coming in right now. Where do you suggest starting to review your missing person policy?
I would start, if your department has an emergency manual, what do you have in the emergency manual? I mean, we've got an emergency manual that's like 38 pages thick. Our missing student protocol is a paragraph when we first started. So how do you expand on that paragraph? How do you add to that? And like I said, this is a great project for a grad student or a professional that just is looking for something they want to really sink their teeth into and get involved with. To start developing even a small committee, start developing a protocol, start developing this, and then go to your dean of students, go to your student affairs folks, go to your law enforcement and say, "Hey, read this over. What do you think? Are there other things you think we should do? Are there things that we could do for you or that we could possibly do as a part of this?" And it's an ongoing process. It's not something somebody can sit down in an hour and come up with a great project. One of the big rules in search and rescue is that you're never alone when you're doing search and rescue. There's always other people with other ideas out there, and you have to be open to those. You have to listen to what other people have to say, and that's the best ideas come out of a lot of people thinking about the same problem.
Thank you. Our next question is, how do you manage media in situations with missing students?
Yeah, media is always a tough one, and this is one of those where it's going to very much vary by your institution and what your institution. I'm sure your institution has a designated media point person who will be the person that will do all the talking to the media. I'm also fairly certain that if you have a student that gets a lot of publicity about being missing, that you're going to have media all over the place, way more than they can control, and they're going to be wanting to interview students and talk to students and sit up on street corners and shoot video and all these other sort of things that goes along with it. I think that's part of having good communication, knowing who you need to talk to at your university, public relations, media office. who not just the person we need to refer them to, but who can I talk to, who can, when I get a weird vibe about something happening or somebody being in the building or wanting to come near the building with a video camera and talk to students. That can be a part of your policy, part of your, generally any emergency response policy is going to have some sort of media section that kind of applies to it, because if you have a tornado come through your campus, or you have some sort of death of a student that occurs in the residence halls, you're going to have these same sort of issues that go on. And so a good media response plan is a part of a good emergency plan.
We have another question here. Seeing as parents often have a heightened reaction to not being able to get a hold of their children who are perceived to be missing, what are your suggestions to go through the process of asking those important questions that may assist in tracking, particularly thinking about PLS and LKPs?
I think parents oftentimes want to give you that information, and it's really more a matter of who needs to be getting that information. Parents often call and get a hold of whoever's working at the center desk, and they want to just throw tons of information at them. But if it's not somebody who's had a little bit of training or had a little bit of thought about what are these LKPs, a parent who says, well, they were going to go to they were supposed to go to the game with their friends, blah, 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 they may just blow that off. They might not think much about that. But somebody that's thought about it before may say, well, hey, what tickets did they use? Did they use their ID card to get in? We can figure out if they ever actually made it to the game or not. Whereas, an untrained student staff member who's working the desk might not think that piece of it is all that important, might not listen to it. So that's where I think it's important that when these sort of things happen, that parents are talking with staff that have been through a little bit of training, have thought through missing persons protocols and those sort of things, and know what and how they can respond. One of the pieces that always comes up is, well, what about FERPA and our students and privacy and all these sort of things? There's no FERPA violation of a parent telling you everything that you can think of about a student. That they can tell you all sorts of things about a student. That's different than what you're telling them about the student. And so a parent who tells you, well, his friends are these people, he normally hangs out here, I think he's a member of this fraternity or that fraternity, or doing this or that. That's all information that you can take and write down and pass along, or act on yourself, depending on who you are.
Other questions out there for John? Can you discuss the transition from search and rescue to search and recover, and what issues might need to be addressed in that situation?
Somebody out there's got some background with emergency management or search and rescue if they ask that. So in the search and rescue world, unfortunately, sometimes you find the person and they're deceased, at which point it becomes a recovery operation. Or sometimes you have good reason to believe that a person is deceased. I know there was a case down in Florida last year where they believed the student had been subject to foul play by another student, and they were pretty certain they were looking for him out in the woods, and they were not expecting to find him alive. So when you move to a recovery operation is when those other pieces of it come into play, and you start looking at, what about campus memorials, and who's going to, foot the bill? Where are we going to get the money to do this event or that event? Have this vigil? People don't think about what's the cost of buying 200 candles, 300 candles, for an event. Well, those candles got to come from somewhere. Somebody has to put that money up, and very often it's people that donate it. It's people who want to do it. But sometimes universities have a role to play in that as well. Certainly if a student does turn out to be deceased, all those counseling pieces come into play, and how do you work with their friends or help their friends through it? I mean, I think most of us that have worked in residence life for a few years have been through the experience of a student death, and how do you handle that and help their friends through these issues, help them get through the semester, and keep going from there. And so a lot of those very similar sort of things come into play.
as we see if there's any last-minute questions, John, would you be able to show us how we can continue this conversation using the new GLACUHO website?
Yes. So you should be able to see it now. So this is the new GLACUHO website, and if you go to Resources and Discussion Forums, and if you look a little ways down, you'll see GLACUHO Webinar Discussions. And right here is Missing Students, Rethinking How We Look for Them. And Eric has already opened up the discussion link on there, and we can continue the discussion if people have questions or thoughts after this. If somebody's watching the recording of it at some point after this and has a question, they can feel free to post on here, and I'll make an attempt to be cognizant of looking back at it and checking on it from time to time. Folks are also welcome to email me at my email address that was on there as well. Swap them here. The folks are welcome to email me at my email address if they've got questions after this. Like I said, I'm glad to work with universities to improve their practice or improve their protocols.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Jamie.
I encourage people to use that.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jamie. I'll let you finish, and then I'll wrap up.
I was going to say, and also if there's other related topics that get you excited or that think there could be more room for professional development, please let the GLACUHO Campus Safety and Crisis Management Committee know, and we can look at how we can better serve you all as a region. That's all, Eric. Thank you, John, very much.
Yeah, thank you,
no
Jamie.
problem. Thank you all for inviting me.
And thank you, John. Great presentation. I can see why this was definitely a big hit at the conference and why you were asked to represent here. Just a reminder to everybody, the recording of today's webinar will be available on our website under Resources, Webinar Archives. It'll be posted as a YouTube video, so you're welcome to share that with any colleagues who may have missed. Additionally, we do encourage you to visit our new website. You do need to sign up for an account there in order to interact with us on the online forum, but it is free. And it is open to anybody, whether you are within our region or a visitor or guest from outside the region. You're welcome to join us there. Thanks again, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you next time for our next webinar. Bye-bye.